Economists widely believe that when two countries open up their markets to international trade, both countries are better off. Based on the principle of comparative advantage, when each country specializes in producing the product that it has a comparative advantage in producing and trades with other nations, the size of the economic pie gets bigger. So in that sense, trade is a positive sum game. Increasing trade between nations increases the overall size of the economic pie, and therefore each country can have the same slice of the pie that it did before, and there's more pie left over for each country to consume. And we're going to show that when we go through examples of this principle of comparative advantage. The first graph shows that in the 1960s, the exports were greater than imports. So the U.S. was running a trade surplus in the period from the 1970 through roughly 1980. The balance of trade where exports just equaled imports was a balanced trade situation. Expanded greatly from roughly 4% of the economy to closer to 9% of the economy. Okay, then between 1980 and the beginning of the 1990s, the U.S. was running trade deficits where imports exceeded exports. And after 1990s, you can see this divergence where imports increased much faster than exports increased. So the U.S. was running substantial balance of trade deficits where we were importing more goods and services than we were exporting, and the size of inputs relative to the size of the economy was pushing 18% of GDP imports, and exports were something in the vicinity of 11% of GDP. And the trade deficits that we're looking at here are somewhere in the vicinity of $500 billion on an annualized basis. And you say, well, why did these trade deficits widen? And part of it in the early 2000s, 2003, China received the most favored nation status in terms of trade. So our balance of trade deficit with China increased over time. And NAFTA had an impact on trade balances as well. And you can see by looking at the second graph, some countries like the United States run substantial trade deficits where imports are larger than exports. Other countries like Germany, imports are larger than exports. But for nations such as France, exports are greater than imports. And it's interesting with China here. In 2012, China actually had a balance of trade deficit where overall they were exporting less than they were importing. But with the United States, China has a very positive trade balance, something in the neighborhood of $150 billion annually with the United States. But overall, they're running a modest trade deficit. The principle of comparative advantage shows that if each country specializes in producing the goods and services that they're best at producing and trade with one another, the size of the economic pie will get bigger and each country will have positive gains from trade. So in this sense, trade is not a zero-sum game. Ricardo was the first economist that developed this principle of comparative advantage. he was a contemporary of Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage was in sharp contrast to British landowners owners at the time that were trying to get the government to pass high tariffs to protect domestic corn producers from international competition. Interestingly enough, China has recently proposed tariffs on U.S. Agricultural production, particularly soybeans. And we'll see what implications the principle of comparative advantage has in connection with protectionist trade policies. Ricardo's example of comparative advantage showed the production relationships between America and England in the production of food versus textiles. But chapter 2 of our text evolves an example that deals with producing computers and shirts in the United States relative to Mexico. So we'll follow through with this example from chapter 2. Okay, in this example, in Mexico, it takes 2 units of labor to make 1 computer. And it takes 2 units of labor to make 1 shirt. So here, 12 units of labor to produce 1 computer and 2 units of labor to produce 1 shirt. That's our production relationship in Mexico. In this example, we also assume that Mexico only has 24 units of labor, and if it uses all of its workers to produce computers, it can produce 2 computers, but it doesn't have any labor resources left to produce shirts. Similarly, if Mexico devotes all of its labor resources to producing shirts, it can produce 12 shirts. In this example, labor is a limited or scarce resource. So at a point in time, Mexico only has 24 workers. So if they want to produce more shirts, they're going to have to produce fewer computers. And for each computer that they don't produce, it's going to free up 12 units of labor. So here we see that if we produce 1 fewer computer, we're going to have 12 units of labor to devote to producing shirts. And those 12 workers could produce 6 shirts. So you could say that the opportunity cost of producing 1 computer is the 6 shirts that you have to give up. So in terms of opportunity cost, you're giving up 6 shirts for each additional computer that you produce. Similarly, if you produce 1 fewer shirt, that frees up 2 workers, and 2 workers can produce 1/6 of a computer. So your opportunity cost of producing a shirt is 1/6 of a computer. So as we've seen before, the opportunity cost of producing this one computer is the 6 shirts that you have to give up. Now, if we carry this example forward to the United States, we see that the opportunity cost of producing a shirt is 1 computer. So in the US, it takes the same amount of labor to produce a shirt as it does a computer. In Ricardo's model of comparative advantage, a country is said to have a comparative advantage if it produces goods for which it has the lowest opportunity cost. What is the opportunity cost of producing a computer in the US? In the US, if the US produces 1 fewer computer, it gives up 1 shirt. So the opportunity cost of 1 computer in the United States is the 1 shirt that it has to give up. In Mexico, the opportunity cost of producing a computer is 6 shirts. So clearly the US has a lower opportunity cost of producing computers than in Mexico, so that you can say that the US has a comparative advantage in producing computers. Now we can look at the opportunity cost of producing a shirt. In the US, if the US produces 1 fewer shirt, it has to give up 1 computer. So the labor that it uses to produce the shirt is the same as what it takes to produce 1 computer. So given that production relationship, the opportunity cost of producing a shirt is 1 computer. In Mexico, if Mexico forgoes the production of 1 shirt, it frees up 2 workers, and they employ those 2 workers to produce computers, and they can only produce 1/6 of a computer. So in this case, the opportunity cost of producing a shirt is much higher in the United States than it is in Mexico. So here we can say Mexico has a comparative advantage in producing shirts, whereas the US has a comparative advantage in producing computers. In this example, the US has an absolute advantage in producing both computers and shirts, meaning that it requires less labor in the US to produce shirts, and it also requires less labor in the US to produce computers. So the US has an absolute advantage, meaning they're a lower cost producer, or at least in terms of labor input, than Mexico for both goods. But what Ricardo's model shows is that even if one country is a more efficient producer of both products, if each specializes in producing the product that it has a comparative advantage in producing and trades with the other nation, both countries are better off because the total production, in this case of computers and shirts, will increase to the point where both countries can consume the same units of each good as before, and because the size of the economic pie increases, has more goods that they can divide between them, so that consumption in both countries increases relative to the no trade situation. Show these gains from trade, we switch to an example of the U.S. and China producing trucks and cell phones. So what we're graphing here is what's known as a production possibility frontier. And in this example, if the U.S. devotes all of its labor resources to producing trucks, it can produce 100,000 trucks, but doesn't have any labor left over to produce cell phones. If they devote all their resources to producing cell phones, they can produce 100 cell phones and no trucks. So initially we're saying that the U.S. produces 50,000 trucks and 50 cell phones, and initially is at this point without trade. China, on the other hand, if they devote all their resources to producing trucks, can produce 50,000 trucks, don't have any labor left to produce cell phones, 0 cell phones. They can produce 200 cell phones and no trucks. And initially, in a no trade situation, China is producing 25,000 trucks and 100 cell phones. And what we're going to show is that if each country specializes in producing what they have a comparative advantage in, that they're going to be able to increase their consumption possibilities or increase the size of the economic pie, as we say. In this example, we can show that the United States has a comparative advantage in producing trucks, and China has a comparative advantage in producing cell phones. We can show in this example that what is the original starting point. If you're in the United States and you reduce production of phones, you get 50,000 additional trucks when you give up 50 phones. So your opportunity cost of producing a phone is 1,000 trucks. Okay, in China, when you cut production of phones by 100, you had to give up 25,000 trucks. So the cost per phone was 250 trucks. So the opportunity cost of producing a phone in the United States is 1,000. This is the opportunity cost of producing a phone. The opportunity cost of producing a phone in China is only 250 trucks. So each country is going to specialize in producing what they have a comparative advantage in producing, and the US is going to have a comparative advantage in producing trucks, so they're going to produce more trucks. China has a comparative advantage in producing phones, so they're going to be producing more phones. And now you say, well, has the size of the economic pie increased? So originally US produced 50,000 trucks, China 25,000 trucks. The total was 75,000. Now there are 100,000 trucks being produced. With cell phones, originally the US was producing 50, China was producing 100, so there was a total of 150. Now China specializes in producing phones, and their production goes up to 200. So in this case, you can see there are going to be more trucks produced when the US specializes, and there are going to be more phones produced when China specializes in producing phones. So you can see there are more trucks and more phones available for consumption between the US and China. And as long as you pick an exchange rate, trucks for phones, that's somewhere between these two opportunity costs, in other words, the 250 trucks and the 1,000 trucks, if you have an exchange rate that's between these two, somewhere between 1,000 trucks per phone and 250 trucks per phone, then both countries are going to be better off as a result of. And here we see that graphically this shows the comparison between the no trade production levels and consumption levels and the consumption with trade. So with trade, the US is consuming more trucks, and they're consuming more cell phones. Similarly, China is consuming more trucks and more cell phones. And the exchange rate that they assumed here was one where you basically exchange 500 trucks for each phone. And that is between the two opportunity costs of 1,000 for the United States and 250 for China. Where they get this 2,000 phones is that these numbers are expressed in millions of phones. So if you looked at it in terms of millions of phones, then it would be 2,000 phones per truck. But what this shows is that even when one country has an absolute advantage in producing one product, if each country specializes in producing the product that they have a comparative advantage in, that they're best at producing, in trade between the countries, there can be expanded production of both goods, and with an exchange rate that's between their opportunity costs, both countries are going to be better off, meaning that they're going to be able to consume more trucks and more phones in this example. So trade is a positive sum game, meaning that the size of the economic pie increases and consumption in both countries can increase. Again, absolute advantage refers to the resource cost of producing each good. How much labor does it take to produce a truck in the United States versus a phone in the United States? So even when one country has a lower resource cost of producing both products, you can have this mutually favorable trade between countries if each country specializes in producing the product that they have a lower opportunity cost in producing. Or another way of saying that is a comparative advantage in producing. This table shows the level of wages relative to the U.S. wage. So essentially the U.S. wage is 100%. Productivity, labor productivity, is the amount of output you produce for a given amount of labor. So here, the United States, this comparison is relative to the United States. So here it shows that Ireland and Norway are two countries that have higher labor productivity than the United States. Most countries have lower labor productivity. And the countries that are listed above the United States have higher wages than the United States. So for example, Switzerland. If you look at the wages in Switzerland, they're roughly 165% higher than the U.S. wage. And their productivity is slightly less than the United States. That's how you would interpret this. Switzerland has a much higher wage relative to the United States and somewhat lower productivity. Many countries with low wages, essentially in this area, the wages would be roughly half of the U.S. wages. Most countries with low wages tend to have productivity that's much less than the United States. So productivity, the amount of output being produced per unit of labor, was half of what it was in the United States. The wage rate paid in that country is roughly half of the U.S. wage rate. So what this table suggests is that part of what explains wage differentials is how productive labor resources are. And there are many things that affect labor productivity. It's the amount of capital that you employ. It's sort of the efficiency of your economy. And there are many, it's the educational levels, skill and training levels. Those are some of the factors that affect productivity. But typically countries with relatively low labor productivity tend to have lower wage rates. Here you have countries with wages that are higher than the U.S., and for the most part, productivity that's lower. So what does that imply? It implies, at least in part, that some countries pay a higher percentage of their total product to the labor input. In other words, the people that own the productive resources are not getting as big a return as the labor component in some of those countries. We're going to look at a few types of things that affect comparative advantage. And the classic examples are if you're in a tropical climate, you're likely to have an absolute cost advantage and a comparative advantage in producing, things like coconuts and coconut oil and palm oil and bananas and things like that. So you basically your climate endowment has a certain impact on the kinds of products that you're going to have a comparative advantage in producing. Bananas grow better in the tropical conditions. So it wouldn't make sense for the U.S. to cultivate bananas because it would be extremely costly to do that in some type of a simulated environment or in only a limited number of climatic areas in the United States. You live in a country that has an abundance of the factor that you're using to produce a product, you're likely to have a comparative advantage in that product. So if Canada has forests that are expansive and are the natural resource or factor used to produce pulp paper, it's likely that Canada is going to have a comparative advantage in producing paper. And if that input that you have in abundance is an important input and one of the main components of the product you're producing, you're even going to be more likely to have a comparative advantage in producing that product. This notion was formalized in the Heckscher-Ohlin model, which shows that if you're producing a product that's labor intensive and you are in a country with an abundant source of labor at a low cost, you're going to have a comparative advantage in producing that product. On the other hand, if you're producing a product that's capital intensive, requiring a lot of capital, then if the country you're in has access to the level of capital inputs that you need, you're going to have a comparative advantage in that type of a process. And so what countries tend to produce clothing, which is very labor intensive. Most of the manufacturing has shifted to Asian countries, China and Bangladesh, and even China, with the wage rates in China, are having difficulty competing with Bangladesh in some of the most labor-intensive production. So clearly, the Heckscher-Ohlin model would explain this type of behavior. If you're in a country with an excess supply of labor and very low labor costs, you're going to have a comparative advantage in producing products that are labor intensive. Now, when you hear about manufacturing moving back to the United States, what type of manufacturing operations are moving back to the United States? They tend to be manufacturing that's relatively capital intensive and doesn't use that much labor. So if the labor costs are not a big component of producing the product. In other words, if the capital costs are much higher, relatively speaking, than labor costs, then companies would not save that much offshoring those types of manufacturing operations if the capital costs are relatively the same, maybe even cheaper in the United States. So it's not labor-intensive manufacturing that's moving back. It's capital-intensive that's moving back because the capital costs in the U.S. Compare more favorably than labor costs. And it's much easier to coordinate production. If the end market is in the United States, it's a lot easier to coordinate the production levels than it is to have offshore production that has to come through a container cargo shipment that might be coming into Vancouver, Canada, or Long Beach, California. Increasing returns to scale in production plays a large role in determining which country has a comparative advantage in producing a product. Like steel, for example, with high capital costs, if you can increase your output and your scale of operation, you can decrease your average cost of producing the product. So you can show in economic models that firms have an incentive to sell steel at a lower price in international markets than they do domestically, even in order to lower their overall average cost of producing steel. And this notion of dumping steel in international markets comes to play, where companies can be selling steel at a price that's below average cost. Here we see that China/Hong Kong at one time was a major supplier of apparel in the United States market, but over time China lost its comparative advantage in producing extremely labor-intensive goods in countries like Bangladesh with lower labor costs and surplus of labor in Bangladesh have increased their market share of textile production because they now have a comparative advantage with their abundance of labor producing goods that are highly labor intensive. Now we're going to take up the supply and demand modeling in Chapter 8 and show how trade restrictions or barriers on trade affect prices and output levels and economic efficiency in international markets. So here we show a market for cell phones, and this is strictly the domestic supply, domestic demand. The interaction of supply and demand would determine an equilibrium price. This is autarky, meaning that there is no international trade. This would be the price if there was no international trade in the domestic market. And this would be the quantity in the domestic market if there were no trade. And then again, the consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve over to the price point. And this would be consumer surplus. Producer surplus is above the supply curve over to the price point, and this would give you producer surplus. And you add consumer surplus plus producer surplus, you're going to get total surplus. Okay, now we can analyze how opening this market for international trade affects our domestic market. And in this example, without trade, the price would be PA and the quantity would be QA. Okay, now we're saying that we're opening the market for international trade, and here the world price is below the domestic price, meaning that the rest of the world has a comparative advantage in producing phones. So we're opening up our market for imports. And what is the impact of that? And the assumption that we're making is when we open up our market, it doesn't have any effect on the world price of phones, which is not a good assumption if you're opening up a market the size of the United States, but if you are opening up a smaller market, it may be more appropriate. So for simplicity, we're assuming that the world price stays the same. The quantity supplied is by domestic U.S. producers is QS. The quantity demanded domestically by U.S. consumers is QD. And you can see that the quantity demanded is a lot greater than the quantity supplied. And that difference between the two is going to be made up of imports of phones that are produced in the rest of the world. So the result is going to be a lower price to consumers. It's going to hurt domestic producers because they're only the most efficient producers are going to be able to continue to produce phones. But it helps consumers because when prices go down, consumers are able to get phones at a lower price, which encourages more people to have these smartphones. Okay, now we can analyze the impact on economic efficiency. Originally, when there was no trade, consumer surplus was W, producer surplus was Y. Add the two together, you get total surplus. Now we allow phone imports, and what happens? It greatly expands consumer surplus. Okay, so it increases consumer surplus by X, which is this area, and by Z, which is this triangle. So consumer surplus, after you allow imports, goes up by X plus Z. Producer surplus goes down, and you can see the amount that it goes down is equal to X. So what you can see is consumer surplus goes way up, producer surplus goes down, but the additional consumer surplus more than offsets the loss in producer surplus. So here you have total surplus going up by an amount that's equal to this triangle, is essentially the gains that you get in total surplus by allowing international trade. So you can argue that total surplus increases when you allow trade. It's great for consumers because it's much lower prices, and it's bad for domestic producers because the profitability is going to go down and their output is going to go down. But overall, the consumer surplus gains are more than offset the producer surplus losses. Now we allow international trade, but the world price is higher than the domestic price would be. So what this means is that the U.S. has a comparative advantage in producing this product. And now how does it affect the U.S. market? The price is going to go up to the world price. Again, we assume that opening up the U.S. market does not affect the world price. So at the world price, the quantity demanded is going to be down here. The quantity supplied is going to be out here. And so this difference between the quantity supplied domestically and the quantity demanded is going to be the number of phones that are exported. So here we see the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded becomes the number of phones that are being exported. And how does it affect economic efficiency? Again, W plus Y is equal to total surplus. Now what happens when we open up our markets for exports, or the rest of the world opens up their market for U.S. products? What happens? Okay, we get a big increase in producer surplus this time because the world price is much higher and producers are able to expand their market through exports. So what happens is producer surplus increases by this amount X and also this triangle Z. So producer surplus goes up by X plus Z. Domestic producers expand their output and increase their profitabilities. Consumer surplus, on the other hand, decreases by this area of X here. So it's bad for consumers because now the price of this good has increased. It's gone up to the world price, but the amount that producers gain is more than the amount that consumers lose. So total surplus increases when countries open up their market for exports. And then you might ask yourself, well, why wouldn't the U.S. open up its market for exports? Well, it turned out until recently, the U.S. was restricted from exporting crude oil, for example. And part of the reason was that with importing so much crude oil, they did not want exports. But how does that affect the world, or how would it affect the world if the U.S. increased large amounts of natural gas, for instance? So when natural gas exports increase, it's going to bring the price of natural gas in the United States closer to world prices that are higher. So consumers in the United States would be paying a higher price for natural gas if natural gas exports expanded significantly. But the gains to producers would more than offset the losses to consumers. And you can show that any time that there's free trade between countries, it's going to expand total surplus. And one of the things that has kept inflation under control in the United States, since the 1990s, is increased foreign imports. Puts pressure on U.S. domestic companies to compete with imports. And if you're in an industry where you can import Chinese machine tools, or Chinese tools, or Chinese steel, it puts a lot of pressure on domestic producers to pick a price point that's comparable to imports. And part of the reason that inflation has stayed relatively low is these competing imports that were price competition for domestic producers. And that's one of the things going forward with these tariffs being proposed on Chinese imports. If you decrease those imports, or if you increase the price by 25%, it's going to put less pressure on domestic producers, and we'll likely see more inflation. If you buy into the free trade argument that if both countries open up their market for trade and countries specialize in trade, that trade is going to negatively impact certain industries and the workers that are in those industries. So if you were producing furniture in North Carolina and that furniture production, manufacturing got offshored or replaced by foreign imports, and then you were retrained in order to provide feedback, tech support feedback, and you find out that your tech support feedback job got outsourced to Bangladesh. You as a worker in two industries that are negatively affected by international trade are going to be worse off, and unless you have the skills to move to some other job. Other industries are positively impacted by trade. If you work for Boeing Aircraft and they're exporting aircraft around the world, clearly, Boeing Aircraft and the workers in that industry benefit tremendously through international trade. And what we've seen is that many of the jobs that were labor intensive have been outsourced, and also improvements in technology mean that you're going to need less labor in general to produce products, even ones that are relatively labor intensive. And in China, for example, technological change has displaced workers in manufacturing in China because even when wages are relatively low, if technology improves, you can employ more productive physical equipment at a cost that's lower than even lower cost workers. So much of the job loss in manufacturing, part of it is offshoring, but the other part of it is technological change means that you need fewer workers, even in industries and countries where labor is relatively inexpensive. So what has tended to happen is the high-tech jobs, companies that are exporting high-tech products have gained through trade. The lower tech, more labor-intensive jobs have been lost. So you've had this situation where there is widening wage gaps, partly because of the international flow of materials. A tariff is simply a tax on imported goods. We analyze the impact of a tariff. It tends to increase domestic production and the profitability of domestic companies and employment in the domestic industry, while it decreases overall consumption because the price of the good has gone up. And the economic efficiency implications is that there's a lower total surplus. One thing that's worth noting is, especially if you're imposing tariffs in relatively capital-intensive industries, like the steel industry, for example, when you impose a 25% tariff on imported steel, what that does is it increases the cost of that steel tremendously, which negatively impacts the companies that are using that steel domestically. And it decreases employment in those industries because of the higher steel costs. So if you're using steel pipe to put in a crude oil or natural gas well mid-continent, and you don't put in that well because the price of the steel increased by 25%, then employment in those industries that are using steel as an input may go down. And in fact, they may go down by enough that it actually more than offsets the increase in employment in the steel industry. Because when you increase steel production, it's so capital intensive, you don't tend to employ that many more people. And then they've done studies that if you take into account the cost of that one job that's being produced, you say, wow, producers are going to be paying a lot more for steel, the companies that use steel, and if you take that additional cost divided by the number of new jobs that are created, it tends to be a very, very, very large number, into the hundreds of thousands many times. So yeah, we'll look at this further, but so when we impose a tariff, we're strictly saying that, okay, initially the world price was below our domestic price. Otherwise, we wouldn't be importing the good to begin with. And this is the world price, and we just add our tariff onto that. So we get a new price that is the world price plus the amount of the tariff. So what that does is originally without the tariff, this was the quantity supplied domestically, this was the quantity demanded. Now with the tariff, the quantity supplied domestically is going to increase, but the quantity demanded domestically is going to decrease. And the difference between these two, which are imports, is going to decrease. So this is what we see is as a result of the tariff, domestic production increases, as we said before. Domestic consumption decreases. The quantity of imports decreases, and obviously the price of the product went up significantly. And the economic efficiency implications is originally this was consumer surplus. This was consumer surplus, the blue shaded area. Producer surplus was this triangle. Okay, so now with the higher price, consumer surplus goes down significantly. It goes down by A plus B plus C and plus D. So you can see this is like a big drop in consumer surplus because the price of the product is higher. So this is our loss in consumer surplus, A, B, C plus D. Okay, now producer surplus is going to increase now. It was this area. Now producer surplus is going to go out to here. So producer surplus is going to increase by this area A. So that increases by A. And we have to add in the government revenue. Basically, the revenue that they collect is the amount of the tariff times the amount that's imported. So this rectangle C is the amount of the tariff times the level that's currently being imported. So C is the revenue that's being collected from importers. So it creates additional revenue, which is equal to C. So if you add all these together, though, the change in total surplus, it decreases by B and plus D. So you can see that by imposing a tariff, it's good for producers, it's good for workers that are working in that industry, it's bad for consumers because of the high price, and many times if you're in a capital-intensive industry, the number of jobs that you create are created at a really high expense paid by consumers in the form of higher prices. So typically in manufacturing industries, the additional cost of these jobs to consumers is somewhere in the hundreds of thousands to sometimes over $1 million, depending on which industry you're imposing the tariff. Another type of import restriction is an import quota, which strictly limits the number of units that could be imported. Limits the amount of steel that the Chinese could import. see that because of the international agreements on trade, like the World Trade Organization is responsible for enforcing most of the trade agreements between the U.S. and Europe. Then you have the NAFTA agreement that looks at trade between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And then the most favored nation trade status for China that was imposed roughly in 2005 significantly reduced tariffs. So you can see that since the early 90s, there's been a significant decrease in the average tariff that's imposed on imports, and that largely is because of these multinational negotiations where essentially you say, well, I'm not going to lower my trade barriers unless you're willing to lower yours. And that's the notion of fair trade. Fair trade, loosely speaking, means that if I open my markets, you should be opening your markets in roughly an equivalent way, so that I'm able to expand my exports to your country and you're able to expand your exports to mine. And that's why many of these agreements are negotiated multilaterally, so that sort of everyone comes on board with the same rules of the road. And there's an adjudication procedure that's set up in the international agreement. For example, the World Trade Organization, if a market is being disrupted by steel pipe imports, for example, from China, or solar panel imports, there's a mechanism to temporarily impose a tariff or trade restriction, and then argue your case before the World Trade Organization. So each of these trade agreements does have a mechanism for adjudicating disputes. And one reason that trade barriers can be imposed are this national security argument. So the U.S., for example, was restricting oil exports, or at certain times they restrict exports of certain technologies. So you can argue based on a national security reason that you're going to protect a market, in order to have enough industrial production, for example, of key materials that you might need from a national security standpoint. But typically these don't tend to be big overreaching concerns at this point. And again, globalization tends to benefit certain industries and the workers that work in those industries, and it harms other industries and the workers that work in those industries. But if there's fair trade, the argument is that the jobs that you gain in one area are going to more than offset the jobs that you lose in another area. So the idea is that if the size of the economic pie is increasing, the challenge is actually moving workers from an area where they're negatively impacted to the areas that are expanding. And this can be difficult because you're not necessarily going to have a steel worker in the Midwest that's going to be able to find jobs easily in a high-tech area that might be expanding because of trade. The other argument is when jobs are offshored, it also increases incomes and has consumers that are more likely to be buying other products from the United States. So this TED Talk is quite interesting. I'm going to post the link for it on our homepage. It looks at the global economic development and particularly the role that India and China has played in terms of developing their economies, and in particular developing their GDP per capita. And it's the TED Talks are very well put together, very well rehearsed, and this is one I think it's relatively short and quite interesting. This area of industrial policy is an interesting one. Basically, should governments provide trade protections for domestic industries that are sort of small scale infant industries? Should they provide subsidies for those industries? And one of the arguments that the current administration makes regarding trade with China is that China has an industrial policy where they are trying to target what they think are going to be the most important areas of technological development in the coming 5 and 10-year period, and tries to target those for Chinese companies and provide incentives and subsidies in order to become dominant in those industries, which is industrial policy. And years ago in the U.S., when they were debating whether the government should play that role, many economists argued that the government is not the best at actually picking, where the best opportunities are going to be. Isn't it market forces that are going to provide incentives for firms to invest their funds and attract funds to the areas that are most promising? So in the United States, we had this debate, over the last 10 or 20 or 30 years, and have largely, abandoned a big chunk of what was considered industrial policy. But Chinese economy, with their central planning, tends to focus on it. And what is an unfair trade practice? The argument is that in China, some of the steel manufacturing, some of the copper production, and other kinds of areas, the Chinese are relatively high-cost producers. But what the government does, because sometimes they're like quasi provincial government owned and operated companies, they essentially provide low-cost financing and make it more easier for companies to stay in business, even if their production costs are relatively high. But on the other hand, the United States has these agricultural policies that provide income supports to farmers and provide a sort of a target price, which effectively is a price floor for certain agricultural products, which essentially is a subsidy to U.S. agricultural producers. So what's an unfair trade practice? What's an illegal subsidy internationally? To some extent, it's in the eyes of the beholder. But this is sort of the argument is, should governments get involved in picking areas that are the most advantageous, and then providing incentives and subsidies for domestic firms to try to reach a critical mass in these industries? Trade agreements can be extremely complicated. We're somewhat familiar with the North American Free Trade Agreement. We can look at estimates on how that affected jobs in the United States. We can look at the trade agreements with the European Union and how the World Trade Organization monitors and arbitrates disputes within the context of that agreement. We can also look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, that was negotiated under the Obama administration, and shortly after the Trump administration took office, they pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a trade agreement with the U.S. and mostly other roughly 11 other countries, most of which were in the Asian Pacific Rim. But if you look at the specific proposals in these agreements, it's extremely complicated. The TPP wasn't so much about lowering tariff restrictions as other agreements in the past had, but it included a lot of provisions, things like, what the type of property rights do big pharma companies have around the world, and if the government does something to subsidize an industry, what recourse do the other firms in that industry have? So a lot of what was in the agreements wasn't just about reducing tariff and import restrictions. It had to do with much more complex issues. So it requires a lot of expertise and training and a real concentration on details to try to make an overall assessment of the relative benefits of these types of proposals. And hopefully at some point you'll have a chance to actually look at the sort of the fine points of these agreements and be able to make an informed opinion about how it's going to affect the U.S. consumer, how it's going to affect U.S. companies, and so on. At the G20 economic summits, you'll see protesters that are protesting various implications of globalization and inequalities in outsourcing. The union groups argue that while American workers can compete on an even playing field with anyone, but when you look at manufacturing offshore and you see environmental regulations, labor law regulations, health and safety regulations in the workplace that are not at all comparable to what's required in the United States, there's a lot of resentment to having offshored workers in poor working conditions, competing with the U.S. Based on a situation that's not considered an even playing field. And the argument is globalization, rather than increasing wages internationally, tends to put downward pressure on wages in industrialized countries. The articles that made a big impression on me talked about the profit margins and the constant pressure to lower costs in some of the most labor-intensive industries, like the tanning industry in Bangladesh. It was looking at the number crunching where people were paid a wage that barely provided them with enough income in order to feed themselves. And then it showed from the perspective of the employer the pressure that were on them to keep costs at this extremely low level in order to be able to make a profit on the contract that was being offered. So it's like a vicious circle, a death spiral, really, where the cost-cutting incentives get forced down and down and down to the point where you're being paid a wage that's barely enough to feed yourself, and that is something that the owners seem to feel they need in order to keep the contract themselves. So it's this relentless pressure to cut costs that negatively impacts these workers, and it's just internationally it's something that globalization is facing.